R.R.Reno has since 2011 served as the editor of First Things, a publication that will be familiar to many of you, and I hope many of you are also subscribers. First Things is America's most influential journal of religion in public life. First Things, which began in March 1990, marks its 25th anniversary this month. Dr. Reno received his PhD in theology from Yale University and taught theology and ethics at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska for 20 years. He has published academically and is the author of In the Ruins of the Church, Sustaining Faith in an Age of Diminished Christianity, Sanctified Vision, An Introduction to Early Christian Interpretation of the Bible. Augustine College students, I think that would be a very good book for you to pick up and peruse at your leisure in between all of your other reading. Fighting the Noonday Devil and Other Essays, Personal and Theological. And finally, in his 2010, his volume on the book of Genesis was published as part of the Brazos Theological Commentary on the Bible. His essays and opinion pieces on religion, public life, and contemporary culture have appeared in Commentary and the Washington Post, among other publications. Dr. Reno has appeared on CNN's Crossfire and EWTN's Faith and Culture programs. Of interest to the Anglicans turned Catholic among us, Dr. Reno has spent the last decade as a Roman Catholic, moving there from the Episcopal tradition in 2004. So as always with our Augustine approach to things, we celebrate the diversity of the Christian tradition, and I know that we have that diversity represented amongst us this evening. And it gives me a great pleasure again to welcome our Weston Lecture for this year, Dr. R.R.Reno.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to get to know Augustine College. I met with students over lunch today and was peppered with some very difficult questions about fundamental things that we face as Christians in contemporary culture. I was forced back to first things in a way that I think testifies to the seriousness of purpose at Augustine College that these students bring to their studies, and that is encouraged by their teachers. So it was a great experience, and may you flourish at Augustine College. And I'll reinforce that: give early and give often to the cause of Augustine College. And if you're not already a First Thing subscriber, shame on you. And to the students, we have a very, very, very discounted student subscription. So if you want to have a subscription to First Things, I think we actually sell it for $10 a year to students. And you just contact our general email, ft@firstthings.com, and we'll get you set up with a student subscription. All right, tonight I want to talk about critical thinking, and what I really want to do is I want to talk about academic culture more broadly. And I graduated from college in 1983 and then did my graduate study, completed in 1990, and then taught until 2010. And so there's a good 30-year period there where I was very much immersed in contemporary American academic culture. And I think probably the Canadian scene doesn't differ very much from the American scene in what I'm going to describe to you guys today. So this is my effort to try to dig down and try to discern what I think as the fundamental problem in contemporary American academic culture. Contemporary academic culture, I think, in the West more broadly. Now, we know today that, or at least in the U.S., there's an increasing awareness at universities that we've got a problem. Students are not majoring in the humanities. I think that humanities majors have dropped by almost 50% over the last 2 decades. So the disciplines that are responsible for transmitting to students our culture are becoming less and less popular. And, a lot of times people think, well, that's a function of, am I not loud enough? Okay. So I think a lot of people associate that with political correctness, and I think that that's a factor, no doubt. But I think that there are deeper reasons why our university culture does not encourage young people to ask sort of the big questions about life. So today I want to sort of delve into that. Now, I'm going to give a critical analysis of critical thinking. And I realized as I was working on this that it would be a failure on my part. In fact, it would recapitulate exactly the problem that I identify if all I did was critique critical thinking, right? And so I've actually devoted a certain amount of energy at the end to try to describe what I think is the alternative to a culture, an academic culture committed to critical thinking first and foremost. So I've given it this kind of punchy title, Against Critical Thinking, but as you'll see, I am not against critical thinking. I am instead against critical thinking as the cardinal virtue of the intellectual life. So that's my background and my rationale in this piece. So against critical thinking. Now, there are two dangers when we go to the train station. We can fail to consult the schedule, and we can get on the wrong train. And this is why when you go to the train station, it's useful to look at the departure board so that we, in fact, get on the right train. It's good to do your due diligence. It's good to do your research, so to speak, so that you get on the right train. But I think we need to be careful about our carefulness when we go to the train station. If our fear of getting on the wrong train leads us to delay for too long, if we look at the board and then consult the schedule and look at the board and consult the schedule and then double check with the ticket at the ticket counter, the train we need to get on could leave the station before we actually get on it. Because if the right train leaves the station without us, we'll also fail to get to our destination. So, two problems that we face if we're trying to get somewhere. One is to get on the wrong train that goes to the wrong destination, but the other failure is to get on the right train, fail to get on the right train that goes to the right destination. So too much caution in travel can be as dangerous as rashness. So now when it comes to education, we worry mostly these days about the dangers of getting onto the wrong train. The danger, in other words, of believing things to be true that are in fact false. We put a great deal of emphasis today on learning how to interrogate, how to challenge, how to criticize. And that is good as far as it goes, but it's one-sided. Yes, we can get on the wrong train, but unless we get off the platform and learn how to form convictions, we will not get on the right train. And to do so in a reliable and a responsible way, I will submit, cannot be achieved through a pedagogy of critical thinking. It can only be achieved through a pedagogy of what I call a pedagogy of piety. And that's something that today's educational culture rarely provides. So the talk here is the contrast between an educational culture focused on pedagogy of critical thinking versus one that treats a pedagogy of piety, treats piety as the cardinal virtue rather than critical thinking as a cardinal virtue. So I think that, maybe I'm preaching to the converted here, but I've got my section here about how it's just really not possible to overstate how much critical thinking is at the center of how current universities understand their educational mission. I've been to faculty meetings devoted to defining curricular goals, and anybody who's been on a faculty know that curricular debates are always the most divisive debates. It really strikes to the heart of what an educational institution is all about. A curriculum is an educational institution's constitution. And so naturally the discussion very quickly becomes intense. The scientists want fact-based knowledge, and the humanists insist on more plastic arts of interpretation and the need for historical and cultural literacy, while the psychologists and the sociologists have their own priorities. And at the end of the meeting, nobody can agree on any particular body of knowledge. So we feel like, oh no, we're going to fight forever over the core curriculum. But worry not. the dean intervenes and says, well, we can all agree that we're teaching our students how to think critically. And everybody says, hallelujah. We can all agree that we are teaching students to think critically. We all come together and we design a curriculum around the promotion of critical thinking. That happens over and over again, I think, has probably happened over and over again for at least a generation in higher education throughout the West. Now, here's a particularly telling example of this consensus. After the U.S. military dropped its don't ask, don't tell policy for gay and lesbian soldiers, the reasons why many elite schools in America had prohibited the ROTC, the program, educational program for officers in training, the reason why they had prohibited them from their campuses fell away. They were originally prohibited during the Vietnam War, and then the gay rights issue became the successor issue to keep them off campus. But the Obama administration got rid of that policy, and the reasons why they couldn't be on campus fell away. In fact, they were restored at Harvard and at Yale and at Columbia. But at Columbia University, a faculty group continued to argue against any military presence on the Columbia campus. And they wrote an open letter explaining why the educational mission of higher education, to their minds, must reject what they presumed to be the essential nature of military training. This is what they said in their letter. Now, I think this was actually a cynical manipulation of the consensus about critical thinking, but it's a telling quote. Quote, here, the most profound opposition between the military and the university, here is the most profound opposition between the military and the university as institutions, they go on to say. ROTC and the military in general trains people for obedience to the chain of command, whereas the university cultivates a critical and constantly questioning consciousness. And like I said, I think this was kind of a cynical manipulation of the consensus, but it is an evocation of that consensus. That is to say, we all agree that the essential goal of the university is to cultivate a critical and constantly questioning consciousness. I think that's a widespread view. They may have been hyperbolic, this faculty group, and in many ways inaccurate, but insofar as they juxtapose, military obedience to authority, I don't think that's actually the way that military trains people solely in the obedience to a chain of authority. But nevertheless, this juxtaposition between obedience to authority and critical questioning is entirely typical of higher education today. The working assumption I've found over the years, the working assumption is that the expert mind that the university is supposed to create roots out falsehoods. And this requires what educators refer to as critical distance. It's an important metaphor, the notion of distance in education today. To create distance. Students need to, quote, step back from convictions, their own convictions, so as to weaken the hold of those convictions on their imaginations, thus making room for cool and dispassionate analysis. I think most educators think that they have to disenchant the beliefs that the students bring with them at age 18 to the university, because that's the first step towards mature intellectual life. You've got to be critical. Critical distance is the first step. And the most basic critical pedagogy, so the critical pedagogy involves inculcating to students a guilty until proven innocent mentality with respect to their beliefs. And there are different ways to do this. We find this in Descartes, this guilty until proven innocent mentality. In his discourse on method, he records his own dissatisfaction with the views that he inherited. I think he went to a Jesuit college or equivalent of a high school and was dissatisfied with the views that were passed on to him in that environment. To his mind, what he learned as a student amounted to a jumble of barely consistent teachings. He reports that the usual way was to proceed is to revise and modify as best one can, criticizing here and reformulating there, much as owners of medieval houses adapted and added to the buildings over the years, which makes for a quaint but haphazard structure. In other words, you're basically loyal to what you inherit, and you modify according to as needed, on an as-needed basis. This approach, though, did not satisfy Descartes. Better, he says, to demolish and then to rebuild anew. And so he adopted his famous method of skeptical doubt. He subjects all of his beliefs to strict scrutiny, presuming them to be false, unless he can prove them to be true. Now, it's interesting that Descartes, writing in the 17th century, describes his critical stance in ways that are now very much a part of the contemporary pedagogies that we find in universities, and they are pedagogies of diversity and pedagogies of pluralism and pedagogies of historical development. Here's what he writes. I learned from my college days on that one cannot imagine anything so strange and so incredible that it has not been said by some philosopher. And later in my traveling, I found out that all those who have views very different from our own are not therefore barbarians or savages, but that several use as much reason as we do, or more. So in other words, you learn like, whoa, not everybody thinks the way I think. And in fact, smart people think in ways that are quite different from the way I think. That's the pedagogy of pluralism. And the same thing holds for the pedagogy of historical change. Descartes notes that fashions change, and what today's generation thinks essential, the next generation thinks absurd. Now, these strategies, challenging inherited assumptions by showing cultural diversity and challenging them by showing historical development, play a central role in our efforts to inculcate critical consciousness into students. This is a standard pedagogy. It's critical consciousness 101, show diversity, show historical change. And we use other methods as well. The standard way to teach ethics is wrongly called the Socratic method. And in this method, the teacher assigns articles on abortion, pro and con, on the death penalty, pro and con, on vegetarianism, pro and con, so on and so forth. I actually did that as a young professor. Colleges and universities, in addition, colleges and universities often justify the shocking extremism of some professors or visiting speakers by saying that they raise questions that stimulate thought and debate. So having someone talk about the legitimacy of killing newborn children, the so-called after-birth abortion, as a recent article in a mainstream journal of medical ethics put it, is supposed to help us think more deeply and more responsibly, and it does it by challenging our inherited assumptions, again, helping us achieve critical distance from our beliefs. These strategies work alongside multicultural education and a strong emphasis on historical development of ideas and cultures. So at every turn, our education is designed to motivate us to do as Descartes did, which is to demolish our inherited house of knowledge so as to rebuild it in more reasonable and in more reliable ways. Now, Descartes expresses a basic underlying goal of the pedagogy of critical reason. Here's what he writes. I have resolved to go slowly and to use so much circumspection in all matters that if I only advanced a very short distance, at least I would take great care not to fall, end quote. Now, by and large, the modern university is a place where fear of error far outweighs the desire for truth. In other words, the fear of getting on the wrong train far outweighs any kind of anxiety that we'll fail to get on the right train. Whether it's the big questions of religion or morality, or even those concerning history and literature, we have developed an intellectual culture of exaggerated circumspection in which, for the most part, large truths are questioned and only small truths affirmed. Now, this is inevitable, it seems to me, if we give priority to avoiding falsehood. John Henry Newman recognized the value of critical reason. One could never accuse Newman of not being a person capable of, he had certainly deep knowledge of historical development, wrote a book on historical development, and had a very keen analytic mind. So he recognized the value of critical reason. The term he used for it, he called it strict reason. It's good to parse argument. It's good to examine premises. It's good to test hypotheses. Moreover, we do well to be conscious of remarkable historical and cultural variation in human experience. In each instance, we can be brought up short, pulling back from error, or, which I think is far more common, recognizing that we are overcommitted to half-truths. I think very few people are committed to things that are just plain false, but we're often overcommitted to things that are only half true. However, as Newman recognized, this approach slows us down, precisely as Descartes himself says, because critical reason requires us to put our beliefs on trial, moving forward only if they can be acquitted by stringent and exacting standards of proof. And we won't get very far. As Newman observed, following Pascal, we talked about this at lunchtime with the students from Augustine College. Newman observed something what I call Pascal's rule. And that is that the uncertainty of truth is inversely proportional to its existential significance for us. The more important a question is, the harder it is to come up with a rock solid, an answer that is, can't be criticized. The larger, more existentially engaging questions of God, the soul, and the meaning of life do not admit of answers that have the near mathematical certainty that Descartes thought necessary in order to build this new, reliable house of knowledge that would not be subject to any kind of defect. It is for this reason that Newman concluded that strict reason is critical and not creative. So he draws a distinction between critical reason and creative reason. Its methods, he writes, quote, will pull down and will not be able to build up, end quote. Critical consciousness clears away the underbrush of error, which is a very good thing to do. Again, this is not a speech against critical thinking simply. So it's critical consciousness clears away the underbrush of error, which is a good thing to do, but it cannot plant the seeds of truth. It burns away the weeds, but it won't fertilize the fields. The pedagogy of critical thinking trains us to hesitate, it trains us to interrogate, and it trains us to withdraw our assent. Its first response is doubt, and in doubting, to cool the passions of our beliefs. But existentially important questions are intrinsically hot questions. We're engaged by these big questions, and the cool distance required by critical reason tends to make answers seem remote and inaccessible. This is one reason why our emphasis or overemphasis on critical reason in education has led to an intellectual culture of expertise without wisdom. Trained to question, we're poorly prepared in the art of answering. Now, in all fairness, Descartes wanted to tear down in order to build up. We can criticize his rationalist philosophy, and many who followed him did criticize that rationalist philosophy. Hume, for instance, David Hume most notably, but also John Henry Newman himself. But we cannot accuse Descartes of lacking ambition. This is not true, however, of the postmodern academy. Critical reason has taken on a new meaning in recent decades, and it's one more associated with critique, I would submit, more associated with critique than it is with criticism. Rather than being an initial ground-clearing move, deconstruction never ends. So we get from that Columbia faculty letter a critical and constantly questioning consciousness. Constantly questioning. It becomes an end in itself, not a means to the end of belief. So instead of using critique as a way to clear the ground for true belief, critique becomes an end in itself. And so I would submit that in our educational culture today, most educators treat critical thinking as an end in itself. Thus the faculty meetings, right, about curriculum. We can all agree that we're teaching them critical thinking It's the end. It's the goal. It's not the means. The rationale for revised general, here, now I'll give you some evidence that that's the case. The rationale for the revised general education curriculum at Harvard University provides a good example of how critical thinking has become an end in itself. This is from their document. Students, that we're told, students should know how to read, it's in scare quotes, how to read cultural and aesthetic expressions, end quote. In other words, the goal is not to convey a particular view of the good life, nor is the goal to argue for a particular view of truth or justice. Instead, students need to be trained to step back. They don't learn what their culture says. Instead, they learn how cultures, plural, work. The Harvard curriculum, again, writes this about cultural studies. These cultural studies are supposed to, quote, help students understand themselves and others as products of and participants in traditions and cultures of belief, end quote. And why are we supposed to do that? So that they can, quote, understand how meanings are produced and received, end quote. A kind of, what? They're to become sort of technocrats of culture. Now this seems to me as critical pedagogy in its purest form. Students are to learn to think critically about culture, and they're not to think within a culture. They are encouraged to stand at a distance, and for how long? Forever. Instead of rebuilding the house of knowledge, as Descartes would have us do, postmodern students get initiated into the priesthood of cultural theory. Rather than learning how to live responsibly within a house of knowledge, inherited or newly built for that matter, they know how houses of knowledge are built. And we know the different explanations of how. How is the house of knowledge built? It's built as an expression of will to power. It's built as a reflection of class interests. It's built as a way of suppressing difference or otherness. It's built built through the circulation of sexual desire, and so on and so forth. There are lots of cultural theories out there. What unifies them is they're all theories about how culture works. They're all technologies of culture. They're all training people to be technologists of culture, I would call technocrats of culture. Cultural managers, not members of a culture. Now, I don't want to go into these theories. I used to go into them and try to refute them and all that sort of thing. And it's a legitimate thing to do, but I've come to see that they're all kind of unified as seeing critical thinking as the cardinal virtue. But I want to emphasize, instead of looking at the detail, I want to emphasize how they all encourage distance, coolness, and diminished piety. As a side note, by the way, there's probably something different between reductive and emergent theories of culture. There's probably something different between Nietzsche and Hegel in terms of the actual effect on the souls of students who think in terms of those systems. But I'm not smart enough to be able, I have an intuition that there's a difference, but I'm not smart enough to be able to explain what that difference might be. So I'll leave that aside. But anyway, this coolness, diminished piety, these qualities are widely championed by postmodern academics, and they contribute to a larger ideals. This is where I've kind of come to see how critical thinking actually serves a spiritual ideal. Because you gotta wonder, why would people do this? Why would we have an educational culture that wants to make a kind of empty, critical moment be perpetual? Right? Why? That doesn't make sense. Why not Descartes? Okay, I understand that. Sweep away the old, bring in the new. But instead, this is sweep away the old, and then sweep away the not so old, and then sweep away everything. Kind of constantly questioning critical consciousness. Why? Why is that? It's because it contributes to a larger ideal, and it's one that was cherished by ancient skeptics and Epicureans. These ancient philosophers who flourished during the imperial era in Rome, they found it liberating to know that there are no answers to big questions. See, we tend to think, religious people tend to think, nihilism, that must be so terrible. And we don't really take seriously the comfort that it can give a person to know that there are no fundamental deep truths about the human condition. So I want to explore the comfort that it provides. They find it liberating. There's a liberation here. The ancient skeptics believed that for every argument, there is an equal and opposite counter-argument. And this allowed them to attain a calming indifference towards the big questions of life. Now, the Epicureans, kind of ancient materialists, obtained a similar peace of mind through a conviction that all reality can be reduced to simple, inert, and aimless material atoms. So there's a kind of calm, there's a sense of release. So differences aside between the ancient materialist and the ancient skeptic, and they were not saying the same thing, although they were arguing, I think they have the same spiritual ideal. Differences aside, they both describe the liberating effect of critical insight in much the same way. So released from the long, painful, and always uncertain search for answers to big questions about the meaning of life, we can attain ataraxia, kind of an ancient Greek word for calm and peace of mind. This release is a grace, this release from the anxiety of needing to know or seeking to know the truth is a grace. It's a salvation of sorts. For when we know that we cannot know, we can then just get on with living our own lives, untroubled by large and existentially engaging claims about truth. As a side note, I would say that there is also a political dimension to this, which is if we know there are no answers to the big questions of life, we won't kill other people in order to defend these answers. So if nothing is worth fighting for, then no one will fight. It's a kind of postmodern dream of peace. So just so we can achieve an interior peace by saying, I don't have to search because there's nothing to be found. I can just live. So also, if there's nothing worth fighting for, then no one will fight. We can have a kind of peace, interior existential peace, a social peace. These are very powerful visions of peace that are very much active in our time. And this freedom from truth, which is what I call freedom from truth, or at least a freedom from strong truths. I mean, we live in a culture that believes in scientific truth, so we're not talking about, but we're talking about a culture in our time, postmodern culture, that seeks a freedom from strong truths, what I call strong truths, not weak truths. These are strong truths that bind our souls. And it has become the overriding goal of our postmodern culture in the West to achieve this freedom from strong truths. Nearly a century ago, Ortega y Gasset, the great Spanish cultural critic, observed what he thought was a fundamental change in human culture. By his lights, and I think he's right about this, from time immemorial, human beings have bent themselves to conform to ideals. So we took the raw material of our lives and disciplined that raw material to serve something higher than ourselves, a higher ideal. To live well, to live beautifully, to live righteously, all of this was an effort to live in accord with something higher. The great innovation in world cultures, what some sociologists and historians call the axial age, the prophets of Israel, Socrates, and so on. This axial age, Confucius, another person from the same period, involved the emergence of articulate voices of dissent within cultures. These voices of dissent questioned inherited ideals, and they questioned established dogmas. But this movement of dissent and criticism sought to perfect and purify ideals, rather than to subvert and diminish the authority of something higher in our lives. The prophets of Israel provide an example, as does Socrates. In these and other instances, a basic assumption about the human condition remains constant. We're created to serve that which is greater. And in that context, critical thinking purifies piety rather than rejecting it. Now, this vision of questioning for the sake of a deepened, purified, and renewed answer to what is ultimately true, that this vision of critical thinking to serve something higher no longer holds sway. Today, as I've been emphasizing, we want a constantly questioning consciousness so that we can attain this ataraxia, this peace of mind of release and freedom from truth. Or take it, Gasset again, writes this, I think, very perceptive observation about the change, the fundamental change in culture. Is it not, he says, an alluring idea to reverse the present attitude completely, and instead of looking outside of life for its meaning, to turn attention to life itself, end quote. These days, he goes on to say, quote, instead of saying life for the sake of culture, we say culture for the sake of life. So he thinks that's our fundamental transformation I think that's what makes postmodernity post, is not life for the sake of culture, but culture for the sake of life. Our ideal then isn't above. It's not something we can revere or be devoted to. Now our ideal is to be ourselves, which of course is not an ideal at all, or at least not an ideal in the ordinary sense of the word. To be ourselves becomes a never-ending project of critique because we must make sure that we remove all that moves us. We have to remove all that moves us because by moving us, it'll move us away from life. Because in being moved, we're drawn away, as I said, from simply being ourselves. Now this paradoxical ideal, I think this is the attraction of peace of calm and peace of mind. To be unmoved is to have that calm and peace of mind that the ancient skeptics and the ancient Epicureans desired and preached. They preached it as a gospel. And I think it's the gospel that's being preached in our time. Now this paradoxical gospel, to be untroubled and undisturbed by urgent feelings that one should be devoted to something greater, to be undisturbed, in other words, by piety, that this paradoxical gospel is being ministered to by our present academic consensus that critical thinking is the cardinal virtue of the intellectual life. As critical thinking diffuses, disenchants, and distances, it neuters the claims of culture that always seek to romance our souls and arouse in us an impulse to believe. So that's my critical thinking about critical thinking. That's my critique of our culture of critique, that at the end of the day, it serves a gospel, and it's the gospel of being untroubled, unmoved, and because unmoved, at peace. Now we go to where I'm not going to just be a critic of the critics. In a startling passage, John Henry Newman writes, quote, I would rather have to maintain that we ought to begin with believing everything that is offered to our acceptance than it is our duty to doubt everything. For the former, indeed, seems the true way of learning. Better to believe everything than to doubt everything. Better to get on some train, any train, than to get on no train. Because if you get on no train, you will never get to the destination. Whereas if you get on some train, you might actually get there. Of course, now we don't face such a stark choice. We don't face a choice between believing or doubting everything. But by putting the issue in such an extreme form, which is very characteristic of Newman to sharpen the logical point, he makes a crucial observation. And that is that our souls are made for knowing. Doubting, however useful it may be as a check on false belief, cannot move the soul toward true knowledge. Since by definition it subtracts rather than adds. It pushes away rather than draws near. We can't come to know the truth unless we get off the platform of critical thinking and board the train of assent and belief. As a great Dominican of the early 20th century, Sertillange wrote, quote, we must give ourselves from the heart if truth is to give herself to us. For, as he writes, truth serves only her slaves. Only the pious mind is a truth-filled mind. Now, we live in a time when our academic and intellectual culture largely fails to guide us responsibly and reliably toward the adventure of a robust knowledge of the inevitably difficult and uncertain truths about how to live well. It's an adventure. These are things about which we can be mistaken. We can get on the wrong train. But the adventure of that journey is something that our academic culture today largely fails to offer us. That's because we do not have, in our contemporary academic culture, a pedagogy of piety. Now, Plato recognized the need for a pedagogy of piety. In the Republic, he writes this: in the world, quote, in the world of knowledge, the idea of the good appears last of all and is seen only with effort. It's an adventure. It's a strenuous adventure to achieve knowledge of the idea of the good. Now, it's against the background of this difficulty that he emphasizes the important role of mathematics and also music. Music for him and for the ancients was a mathematical discipline. The important role of mathematics and discipline play in the education of the guardians, the lovers of truth who should rule the ideal city. Now, the reason for this mathematics and music is twofold. First, the wise educator gives the truth seeker, the wise educator recognizes that the truth seeker needs occasions of intellectual satisfaction, assent to truth, in order to encourage us to make further efforts. You know, you need to have some confidence that such things exist so that you can go to the next point. We need foretastes of the pleasure and joy of a fuller knowing. We need to feel the force of the geometrical proof, relish the power of these mathematical truths. And to do that, as we relish this power, we desire truth itself more fully. The second reason is that we need to savor truth so as to become more familiar with its taste. A proper habituation of assent helps us to distinguish between true and false beliefs when proofs no longer are available to us. That's why Plato prized the abstraction and universality of mathematics. He regarded these qualities, the abstraction and the universality, as a kind of fitting preparation of the mind for apprehending the forms or the ideas of truth, which he also saw as abstract and universal. Because you know it when you see it, because your mind has been trained by mathematics to what your tongue, your intellectual tongue, has been habituated to the taste of truth. Now, I'm more inclined to emphasize history and literature, which fixes our attention on the concreteness and particularity of the real, and this prepares us to discern truth in the stream of history, which is where we're destined to live. But whether this is a disagreement among friends, it seems to me, because the basic notion of pedagogy remains the same. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, may involve critical thinking, but it requires a pious mind first and foremost. We become lovers of truth not by ferreting out error, but by learning to relish, affirm, believe, and embrace. Mathematics does that. It teaches a young person how to relish, affirm, and believe and embrace truth. In his own way, Aristotle also spoke of the need for the pedagogy of piety. At the outset of the Nicomachean Ethics, he observes that unlike mathematics and other precise sciences, we cannot attain a high degree of certainty in moral and civic matters. Reasonable people can disagree about very fundamental matters in the polis. Therefore, in this context, judgment plays an important role, and sound judgment comes from a lifetime of careful habituation. The wise man is not someone who is expert in raising doubts. Instead, he has firm, settled convictions that allow him to answer the question of how to live well. And again, quoting Sir de Lange, the great Dominican, quote, "Truth visits those who love her, who surrender to her, and this love cannot be without virtue." As he says elsewhere, quote, "Purity of thought requires purity of soul," end quote. Now, this sounds pious, and it is pious, but it's also accurate. When it comes to scholarly debates of anything of consequence, I mean, I found this to be the case as a young graduate student. I remember what was it? It was Hans-Georg Gadamer came to Haverford College, where I was an undergraduate student, and whatever you think about Gadamer, he was a very serious person who conveyed a certain gravitas of considered judgment about important things. I mean, you know, he might have been wrong about a lot of them, but you knew that this was somebody who was, as Aristotle describes the wise man, habituated in a deep way to love and respect truth. So in scholarly debates of anything of consequence, I have found myself listening far more carefully to scholars whose judgment I trust than people who are experts. And who are those people whose judgment we trust? They're serious people who put themselves and their own convictions on the line in discussions and debates, rather than being clever or entertaining, or as is more common, speaking as a scholarly expert at a distance. Always that metaphor of a distance, at a distance from actual convictions. I mean, I think, as a matter of fact, and this is true as a professor, it's true, you go to these academic meetings, and the ones that pack out are almost always the ones that feature the scholars who venture something, who have ventured something in their own writing and scholarship, ventured something larger than simply matters of expertise. We want to hear from judicious thinkers who venture beyond the safety of critical thinking and who take the risk of making claims about truth. Well, I'm drawing to an end here. I won't go on too much longer. Now, when I was a young professor, I used this pseudo-Socratic pro and con approach. I remember I started in 1990 at Creighton University. I thought it was my job to present various points of view with some scrupulous objectivity so that my students wouldn't know what I really believed. It's kind of a source of pride for professors often to be told that their students didn't really know what they believed. And I bought into that vision, which is basically one of critical thinking. I came to see that I was doing more harm than good. Irony and distance are pervasive today. My students needed no training in how not to believe, which is basically what I was doing. And so slowly I changed. I mean, I may be slow, but I'm not stupid. And so I slowly changed. And the lecture hall is not a church. And so I didn't preach, and it would be inappropriate to turn the lectern into a pulpit. But I began to order my courses towards conclusions rather than questions. And so, of course, we considered objections, and we considered historical context, and we considered other factors. And yes, of course, half-baked ideas were criticized, and various errors were dissected. These are elements of critical thinking that were obviously a necessary part of any kind of serious argument about truth. And I tried to make some kind of argument about truth over the course of a semester. I wanted the course to be finally about what might be true. Now, I can't say I succeeded as often as I would have liked. Moreover, I want to say that in an academic context, the successes that we achieve are not always very grand. Important truths are elusive. And often the professor and the student must be satisfied with the hard task of getting Augustine right, rather than settling the deeper question of whether he is right. I mean, there's a kind of pedagogy of piety with respect to a great book, which is that I am going to try to give a true reading of this text. And that, to my mind, I talked about literary and historical study. To my mind, that has for me been a pedagogy of piety akin to mathematics for Plato. That to shape your soul to desire to be right about Augustine is to prepare your soul to want to be right about the questions that Augustine asks. And I think that's an important pedagogy. But my point again is that this is part of a pedagogy of piety. For learning how to affirm a true reading of an important figure becomes a foretaste of affirming the deep truths about which he writes. To teach toward assent, however modest, is to engage in the pedagogy of piety. To teach towards assent is to engage in a pedagogy of piety. Now, no student is well served by critical thinking as an end in itself, or probably, again, I'm preaching the converted here, I'm sure. Unbelief may be pure, allowing us to compliment ourselves so we are undeceived, but it is finally sterile and empty. By contrast, although belief risks error, it makes the embrace of truth possible. You cannot believe as true those things that you refuse to believe. You have to believe in order to allow truth to enter your mind. And this is why the Catholic tradition has long seen the Virgin Mary as the patron of true philosophy. It's fascinating, you know, I was working on a different topic, but related, and I read it was John Paul II's encyclical on faith and reason, which ends with a prayer to the Virgin Mary, a prayer for the renewal of reason in the West, and that she might be our patroness in our pursuit of truth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. She's the patron of true philosophy, I think. I can't remember the exact terminology that John Paul II uses in that, but I remember reading that, being very baffled. Like, what? The Virgin Mary? I mean, what philosophical theory is she famous for? You know, why not Thomas Aquinas? You know, or if you want to be scriptural, you know, St. John, you know, the great metaphysical resonances of the Gospel of John. And I kind of struggled with this. It's like, what? How does that work? But then I began to realize that the Catholic tradition sees the Virgin Mary as the patron of true philosophy because she gives herself over to service, to the service of God's Word. And she does so without reserve. Let it be with me according to your word. So she ventures her entire self, which is precisely what makes the lover of truth a lover. So, the patron of true philosophy has to be a lover first before one is an intellectual. And I think that's why the Virgin Mary, who initially I couldn't fathom how she could possibly be a patron of true philosophy, I came to realize, of course, one has to be a lover first in order to be a lover of truth. Now, the intellectual life is different from the spiritual life. So we have to have piety, in other words, before we have to have love and piety before we have reason and critique. Now, the intellectual life is different from the spiritual life. Our tradition has long been self-critical, and rightly so, I believe. We've been inspired by the example of Socrates and motivated by the ancient prophets of Israel. And in that motivation and inspiration, our inherited culture teaches us to interrogate and question rather than to abandon ourselves in perfect obedience. And so the universities in the West are right to cultivate a critical thinking. Yet the critical moment is not primary. It cannot be primary in any living culture of truth. Piety is more fundamental. And what we need today is a pedagogy of piety. We need something of the spirit of the Virgin Mary's self-abandoning trust. We need something of her disposition of love. For when it comes to moral and spiritual truths, we can only truly know that which we allow into our hearts. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions. I covered a lot of ground. Yes. So the question had to do with the role, how we are to understand Socrates' his own critical questioning in relation to his piety. My reading of the Platonic dialogues as a whole is that Socrates is a figure whose role is to purify the piety of Athens, and so it's to deepen and internalize the piety of Athens. And so it's very telling that when you reach the aporia, when you reach the point where the dialectic can't move you forward, he often adverts to myths, stories, in order to raise the soul of his interlocutors to this higher truth. So it's not an end in itself. It's an end. It serves piety. I mean, you have the kind of I.F. Stone reading of Socrates. I.F. Stone was a journalist who wrote about these sorts of things, mid-20th century, and there's a certain kind of modern liberal view where Socrates is the great iconoclast. I see him as a enemy of superficiality, which is not an enemy of conviction at all by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I think that this is one of the basic ways at the West, and I drew the same. I drew an analogy here to the prophets of Israel, that these are great campaigns of purification of their traditions, and to a certain extent successful campaigns. So it's telling that Ezekiel has to swallow the scrolls, which is an image of memorization, and so the purification can only come from the center of a society, I think. One of the problems we face today is that we often have in our own societies a kind of an attempt to reform that is not fundamentally loyal to the core of what our societies are trying, what our societies are, our own cultural genius as a society, and so the prophets of Israel, their denunciation from the center, not from a denunciation out of loyalty, not denunciation out of doubt.
I'm wondering if the critical thinker academic would respond, well, that's precisely the problem, that you're in a culture, and 500 miles down the road, there's going to be another culture, and somebody's going to be fed different scrolls, and so that's precisely what we're trying to do with critical thinking is solve that problem. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, what's your solution to that problem without making critical thinking into an idol?
Right. I mean, one can achieve a kind of awareness of the contingency of one's own convictions. I think that one advantage that Christians have over secular Enlightenment influenced people is that we're deeply, profoundly aware of the contingency of our own faith. I mean, it's a gift of grace, our faith. And so we're aware of that contingency. But for God becoming man, these are things that this would not be available to us. So we have that advantage. Now, but that doesn't speak to this larger question. It seems to me that we have to. It's a question I would want to answer on many levels. So, okay, so what do we do about the Muslims? Let's not put too fine a point on that, all right? Critical thinking says we ascend above them, and from above, from on high, we manage them, right? We manage the Christians, we manage the Muslims, because we understand how culture works, how meaning is produced. I find this a distasteful relationship to people who are going to rule me. And I think that Muslims don't like it either, and it's not going to work. Instead, I think that I'm in favor of engagement by encounter. It's a face-to-face, and not trying to ascend above people who disagree with us about fundamental questions, but a face-to-face engagement about what is in fact true. And that can be painful, and it can be difficult, and it may actually end up being violent. But the other alternative has not proven itself to be successful. So the failure of our own, the failure of our own approach. And then secondly, I would say this too. I would say that as we face a kind of globalized reality where there's intensifying conflicts about these ultimate questions, that it's a Sermon on the Mount is going to go a lot farther than critical thinking in producing a culture of peace. So love is a lot more. Love is a virtue that I think will be much more effective than this sort of management, multicultural management, critical thinking management of conviction. And I think actually the West is increasingly disarming in this regard, weakening itself. Identity politics has almost nothing to do with the actual issues that we face. We are facing an increasing, the 21st century is going to be a time of conflicts of conviction, not conflicts of race, class, and gender. Certainly not conflicts of sexual orientation. It's going to be conflicts of conviction. And people who actually know, have labored in their own lives. I'm going to get passionate here, aren't I? People who've actually labored in their own lives in a disciplined way to try to discern and live in a life of obedience to truth, I think are far more likely to be both trusted by other people trying to do that who think differently, and also likely to be a lot more humble and a lot more understanding of people who think differently. We're aware of the fragility of our own journey towards truth. We're aware of how difficult it is to buttress it with reason, and so, you know, this strikes me as a much more powerful preparation for global citizenship than the sort of than cultural theory, which I think strikes me as a kind of a technocracy of the soul that is itself soulless, and I think will ultimately be rebelled against by people who are not willing to let their convictions be managed.
Professor, you talked earlier.
Ooh, I never quite put it that way before, but I feel very strongly about that.
Professor, you talked earlier, the first part of your talk focused on this whole idea of this hermeneutic of critical thinking that kind of permeates the university and really the society at large. I'm just curious about your impressions, though, because it seems to me there's a great paradox in our society, and especially at the university level, where you have this it's a certain facade of critical thinking, but it's a critical thinking of only a certain, well, let's be honest, the Judeo-Christian principles, right? So if you bring up issues of homosexuality, abortion, God, the state of Israel, whatever it might be, whenever you're inviting a speaker in to address any of these issues, these people can't even give a talk at these universities. So there seems to be this great paradox. So on the one hand, the label on the product says, yes, we're all for critical thinking. But on the other hand, there's this great totalitarian undercurrent that is quite obvious. And yet, so we have these two competing, it's almost an official hypocrisy, but it's there. So I just wanted you to address that.
How can I say I'm trying to say something fresh about a very tired topic, which is the painful paradox of the painful paradox of the contemporary university, which is that a place of free inquiry that's heavily policed. True. Let me just put it in political terms. It's not an accident that I think that the Epicureans and the ancient skeptics flourished during the imperial period. And it's not an accident that Israel had kings. I think that a culture of truth creates a monarchy. It creates a hierarchy. Because, and it's not necessarily a political monarchy, but it creates a hierarchy of truth. And there are people in a culture of truth, there are virtuosos of truth. And those virtuosos have a right to rule. We want them to rule. In a democratic culture, we want them to rule. And in other cultures, pre-democratic cultures, they were heavily subjected to a great deal of habituation in order to deserve their right to rule that they inherited at its best, obviously. Many things were. So in a culture of doubt, in a culture of critical thinking, in a culture that wants us to be free from truth, we get an empire. And empires always have to be policed because they can only sustain order through fear and intimidation rather than a shared loyalty and devotion. So that's that's a little cryptic, but that's my deep attempt to sort of, try to understand rather than just simply hectoring the liberals for not being consistent. And I've done that for 20 plus years, and it doesn't work. They grimace because they're aware that they're not being consistent, but at the end of the day, they don't change. And so that has made me want to go deeper and sort of say, why? What is this? What is going on here? What are we really up against? And how can we articulate to people why, even if you disagree with me, that the vision I have of human flourishing is more humane than what we're being offered today? Join me, argue with me. And we have to figure out how to tell that to our neighbors. You don't have to become a Christian. You don't have to, but you could be whatever. You could be an Aristotelian. But join me in trying to restore a culture that wants to organize itself around truth rather than around freedom from truth.
So in presenting this challenge to critical thinking, you've given us a lot of the philosophical antecedents, whether it's in the Epicureans or the skeptics or Descartes, and then also the critique through Newman in particular. And situating it within the context of a postmodern world that we live in, particularly, almost exclusively in the West. But the question that kept running through my mind as you were speaking was, why now? Why at this point in history? There's this sort of philosophical trajectory you can trace.
Yes.
But I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about the impact of the history of the 20th century on causing this, being a bit of a causal, there's a causal relationship there perhaps, where there seems to be a great fear of staking a claim, of people standing on their feet and say, here's where I stand. We talked a little bit over dinner about the fear of ideology and the virtue of the post-ideological age in politics, and somehow this is a good thing. What about the impact of all of the horrific atrocities of the 20th century, world wars, genocides, and so forth? The idea that, well, if we stake a claim, then someone can contest my claim, and there's going to be a conflict, and we can't have conflict. God forbid we have any conflict of any sort. And that seems to be the world we're living in the West today. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on the historical antecedents. Right.
That's, I think, very perceptive and accurate. We know that the masters of suspicion, come from the post-war European context. You have Nietzsche and Freud and people like that, Marx, but they really deconstruction and cultural theory are European products. Right, and it's totally understandable. You kill a few million, tens of millions of people, and it's a sobering experience. 1914 to 1945 is a cultural trauma of the first order in European and Western culture. Now, we Americans didn't feel it that way because we won, and we didn't suffer domestically the way that Europe did. Our trauma really had to do with slavery and its aftermath, 100-year aftermath. And so their strong beliefs in America are always, the specter of racism is always hovering over strong beliefs in America. And in Europe, I think the specter of the Holocaust is always hovering over strong beliefs. So it's understandable. Jacques Derrida, I was teaching him in Vilnius, Lithuania, to some theology students there, and the woman who invited me was listening to me kind of spell it out. She's the one that clued me into this whole Epicurean thing. And she said, we had lunch afterwards, she said, it sounds just like Sextus Empiricus. And it, like a little light bulb, but why didn't I see that? This is a spiritual theology. It's a spiritual therapy. And, he came of age when in Paris, he's from a secularized Jew from Algeria in Paris. So you have Algeria torn apart and much death and destruction. And then post-war France was torn apart by ideological conflict. People were executed for ideological vendettas after World War II. And that kind of sense of at least execution, not literal, but as close as you could get to cultural execution of dissent, was very powerful in 1950s France among the Marxists, among the communists. And I think he recoiled from that and said, oh, we can't do this. We can't live this way. And so deconstruction is a kind of a spiritual therapy of release and relaxation, so that the fires won't burn so brightly in us. Now, I think that we have a tradition. I think Michael Burley's books on 19th and 20th century Europe are excellent, and his analysis of the problem there is that you get political culture that is energized by religious passion, and that the modern European history should not be seen. It's a misdirected passion for truth, rather than the passion of truth itself. And I would say too that I think that there's a kind of naivete in somebody like Derrida. Again, I don't think it's going to work. That false beliefs false loves can only be reliably overcome by true loves. And so lovelessness turns out to be impotent, I think, in the long run against false loves. So I think ideological passions have a way of reemerging, whether it's right-wing populism or what have you. So we have to purify the human desire for truth, I think. And that's the role of reason. Reason purifies our piety. It can't replace it with some sort of endless cycle of critique, endless circling of critique. Yes?
You've spoken about the presumption in the academy, and many of us listening might have presumed that you're talking about the secular academy. But I wonder if, in fact, you're not yourself thinking about something broader. I mean, if we were to take a Christian college, how about Augustine College, which teaches questions as if there were answers, thinking as if there were purpose, learning as if there were wisdom, knowledge as if there were truth. I'm teaching in this program. This college was created almost to be the antithesis of what you described. But when I ask questions in class, and I wonder if maybe the problem is me, given something you said about your own change in your approach to teaching, but when I'm asking questions about these answers we're presenting, given by, say, Augustine, or the view of purpose of Aristotle, or some aspect of wisdom, and I ask the class, I'm reluctant to say, I think. I hated those courses at university in which I always knew what the professor thought. And I hesitate, and so I want to ask questions. Do you think this is true? And the two things that I often get in response to that are maybe and circumstances. Well, in this or that circumstance, then. Now, I wish I could have any answer but those. I wish I could have yes or no, but not those answers. Because when you say maybe, well, what can anybody say? Or when you say there might be some circumstances in which, well, what are the circumstances? They never come up. And so in a way, what happens, I'm going to fend off the dirty looks I'm getting from them. When you came, I thought you were going to help me with my students. But in fact, you're talking about the secular academy, and I'm wondering, well, actually, are you? Is there some kind of, what is the fear? What do you think is going on?
Oh, it's definitely in Christian colleges and universities. I mean, the Creighton faculty, that was a direct report on how the Creighton faculty solved its curricular battles, critical thinking. Now, in all fairness to Creighton, there's a required theology class, actually 3 required theology classes, 2 required philosophy classes, and 1 required ethics class. That sends a very strong message to students that there are things to know. There are things that are essential. And it's not just an open field for reason to play around with things. And I think that you shouldn't underestimate how a mandatory curriculum actually does a lot of work in conveying to students that there's something that has to be, that is an act of piety on the part of a faculty to say, you must read X, Y, and Z. You must study X, Y, and Z. That reflects the faculty's piety we are going to bind ourselves to this as our curricular ideal. But your point about maybe, look, when I teach, I agree, catechesis is not the same as college education. And there are different modes in which we engage people intellectually. Catechesis is an intellectual undertaking. But people come for catechesis, they want to be guided. They want to have their mind stocked with what the church teaches or what the gospel proclaims. College is a time to try on and inhabit these things more deeply. And so the maybe seems to me to be an entirely expected moment. The question is, where is that maybe going? Where is that maybe going? I mean, for me, I'm trying to think back to my own college experiences. I read Karl Barth. That was a big transformative experience for me. Again, sometimes it's the books that are assigned and not what the teacher says. I mean, if you assign Karl Barth and you do not deconstruct him, then you are confronting a person who is saying, to hell with academic standards, the gospel speaks on its own terms. And that hit me like a ton of bricks when I was 20 years old. Like, this is something that I don't just think about. This is something that I have to decide whether I believe. And the teacher didn't say Karl Barth is the greatest thing since sliced bread, but the teacher did not get in the way of that book. He did not say, well, of course, coming as it did in the aftermath of such and such, and put it in the historical context. No, he presented it as an actual spiritual, as a testimony that had to be taken on its own terms. I'm very grateful to that teacher. I took 7 classes from that one teacher over the course of my undergraduate education. Precisely because I sensed that was a teacher who was going to force me to actually, ask the question of truth. But even though I knew what he believed, I eventually came to know what he believed. But that wasn't why I started moving in that direction. Does that make sense? So I think, again, the pedagogy that we use as teachers in different milieus, in different contexts, there's a mode in the pulpit. There's a mode in Sunday school teaching. There's a mode for secondary school kids. There's a mode for undergraduate education. There's a mode for graduate education. They're all different. They're all different. And there are also different styles that teachers have in how they approach it. And I wish I could give people a formula. If you just do this in your classes, you will inculcate a pedagogy of piety. But it's not so. And moreover, it's very difficult because the pedagogy of critical thinking is so pervasive. It's our default. If anybody who has a PhD is so deeply trained in that way of thinking that it's very difficult to break out of it. And so I hope tonight that it's not so much that I'm giving you a template as giving you a sense, 2 things. One is how much is at stake here. There's a lot at stake here. I believe this is the mother lode of where we are, not just in our educational culture, but in our culture more broadly. Freedom from truth, love of truth. Those are fundamental choices that we have to make And then also to give a kind of evocative language to want to seduce you if you're not already a patron, or renew and redouble your commitment to a pedagogy of piety. How that gets worked out strikes me as a matter of prudence and wisdom for every teacher to work out in the classroom.
We'll take one last question.
But what can you say to the students who are afraid to believe what they think might be true?
I would say, okay, there they are, right? I would say this. I would say this. First, it's dangerous. Life is dangerous. Faith is dangerous. Belief is dangerous. It's entirely reasonable to draw back from the brink and not to jump in. It's entirely reasonable. It's a dangerous thing. We risk our souls when we venture profound convictions. We feel that. That's why we tremble on the edges of conviction, especially when it's something that's deeply consequential, and especially when it goes contrary to what our society in general, what the sort of standard beliefs are. So the first thing is you're entirely justified in hesitating. Second thing is, nothing ventured, nothing gained. If you don't take the risk, the consequences will be far more devastating than to go down a false road for even a very long time, and have to turn back and go back the other way and go to where you started. Standing still is a far more perilous thing for us as human beings. And I don't mean just the salvation of your eternal soul. I just mean your capacity to live a full human life. So take the risk.
We've used the term piety. We haven't really defined it. Words change their meaning, and now piety has become a very feeble word. It means devotion, devoutness, religiosity, religiousness. I don't think that's what you mean by it.
I want the word back.
Well, I was going to ask you to define piety without using the word piety or pious. So we know what you're talking about. Sorry.
Sure. I mean, partly I choose piety because I like it as a provocation. I like the provocation. I think we need to heighten. I chose the word because I want to dramatize the fact that there is a fundamental phenomenological difference between questioning and assenting. There's a fundamental phenomenological difference between seeing the primary, what it means to be a serious intellectual is to be devoted to something, to serve it, and to obey it, is actually a greater sign of intellectual achievement than the capacity to take arguments apart, to slice and dice, to raise objections. Like I said, I went back to my observation about Gadamer when I was a young student, made a big impression on me, and Jürgen Habermas came also. He made a big impression on me. These were serious people who were not clever, and so people can be really, 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 really good, and not just in a clever sense, but they can be really, really, really good at showing the weaknesses in arguments. And they are not, in fact, the most important people in any culture. The most important people in any culture are the people who have devotion. They're the most important people. They make the sacrifices for truth, to live in accord with the truth. They're the ones who are devoted. They pass it on, right? They're the ones who are so devoted that they want students. One of the great crises in the education today is we have today professors who do not want students. It's never in human history has there been teachers who so disliked having students as the contemporary university professor. Why? I don't know why. I mean, were they going to be immortal from what they write? No, it's you only live through your students, so even your self-interest should be directed to your students. But a lover of truth, a person with piety, wants to transmit, wants to pass it down, wants to hand it along to, because they cherish it. And so I think that's, again, I think this is kind of where we are as a culture today. I am optimistic, somewhat guardedly. I'm guardedly pessimistic, I think is the right term. Things are definitely bad. They're probably going to get worse. But ultimately, the future is going to be shaped by the people who are willing to make sacrifices for the future. And I don't think critical thinking is not a mode of training that prepares the soul for devotion. And instead we get investment bankers, management consultants, and technocrats. These are not people who are going to make sacrifices for the future. Future rests in the hands of people who are willing to make sacrifices. And that's not just a Christian view, although I think the gospel is supremely capable of preparing us to make sacrifices for the future. I think it's a general feature of culture. And in that sense, I'm optimistic. So those little pockets of piety I think, are going to be very influential in the future. You know, there are kids today being homeschooled, going to little Christian colleges, doing great books programs, here even at Augustine College. Those people, you are going to be more influential to the future than lots of very clever and well-credentialed people who aren't really sure what it is that they believe. Thank you.